I'm Anna Rose. Hello, everyone. I'm the Exhibitions and Programming Associate at the Wende. Thanks so much for joining us today for the 14th talk in our Cold War Spaces series. Today's guest is Eric Avila, and on the topic of urban space freeway construction and its community impact. He's an urban cultural historian studying the intersections of racial identity, urban space, and cultural representation in 20th century America. He's the professor of Chicano Studies and Urban Planning at UCLA. He's the author of Popular Culture in the Age of White Flight, Fear and Fantasy in Suburban Los Angeles. His latest book is The Folklore of the Freeway, Race and Revolt in the Modernist City, and we'll be hearing more on that topic today. Today's program will be a 30-minute interview, a conversation between Eric and Joes Segal, the Wende's chief curator and director of programming. After that, we'll allow about 15 minutes for the Q&A, so please have your questions ready to put in the Q&A box during that time. We also have the chat function open, so if you have any comments that aren't questions, you can type those in for everyone to see. And as we're getting started, feel free to say hi in the chat. Afterwards, this week, I'll be sending a short questionnaire about the series to help inform future virtual programming. So please look out for that in the follow-up email, and thanks to all of you who filled out the one we sent out last week. We'll be posting this recording of today's program on our Vimeo page, and afterwards you can share it, go back and view it, and go back and see some of our past programs. Lastly, I'd like to thank Susan Horwitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting discussion series at the Wende and our virtual programs. And Joes, I'll hand it off to you to get started.
Okay, thank you very much, Anna Rose. As we know, the Cold War was a period of ideological competition, but it was also a period of global developments transcending the political divide. One of those global trends was the radical modernization of urban planning and transportation. Especially in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, old city centers were demolished and freeways rigorously cut through existing urban neighborhoods as the next step toward the realization of utopia, both in the capitalist West and the communist East. But the modern dream encountered social, cultural, and environmental concerns and resistance. Today, we will focus on the story of freeway construction in the United States, its vision, political agenda, and the freeway revolt it inspired among affected communities. We will speak about cultural resilience, racial identity, and spatial justice in the context of Cold War urban history and beyond. Eric, welcome to Cold War Spaces.
Thank you, Joes.
Okay. Looking forward to this. In your book, The Folklore of the Freeway, your first book, you stated many of the interstate freeways owe their existence to the Cold War. Can you explain the connection?
Yeah, so the federal policy, the federal program under which most freeways were built, under which a national highway system was built, was called the National Interstate Highway and Defense Act of 1956. This was a bill that was passed almost unanimously by a divided Congress in 1956, and it reflected a general consensus during the Cold War that highways were necessary to connect urban centers in the United States, to create a national highway network, to facilitate access between new suburban development and older urban centers. But the defense in the name of the bill also alluded to Cold War concerns. I mean, this was the Eisenhower administration, this was the 1950s. The United States was quite busy building up its arms, its military bases throughout the United States, and highways were seen as essential to that work. So here in Los Angeles, for example, during the 40s and 50s, a number of military bases were built throughout Southern California, not in urban centers like Los Angeles, but in more suburban areas, Orange County, San Bernardino County, Ventura County. And the idea was that highways would create a link between all of these different military bases and to the Port of Los Angeles and to Los Angeles itself. So Highways were built with defense in mind during the Cold War era, though that was not the only objective in building highways.
Would you say, was it the main objective, or was it just something that came into consideration next to all the other functions of highways?
I think it was an important objective. I think, you know, if you go back and look at, you know, some of the discourse surrounding justifications, defense certainly came up. But, you know, oil industries, automobile industries, other kind of construction, road building industries, concrete, gravel, steel, glass, were also strongly advocating and lobbying Congress to pass the Interstate Highway Act. So defense was important, but there were many other considerations as well.
I see. So we will focus in our conversation mainly on the United States and its freeway construction, but I want to ask you one question about a significant parallel, in my view, with the communist and East Bloc countries, where freeway construction also was very important in the 1960s and 70s. Would you say that they followed the same pattern and the same motivations, or is there a different story behind the freeway construction in the communist countries, as far as you know?
Well, that's a good question, Yus. I think you might know more than that than I do. I haven't had an opportunity to study a more global history of highway construction. I think that's a book that's waiting to be written. But I would imagine that defense was an important concern in Soviet bloc countries as well.
Right. Okay. Then let's talk a bit about another function of the freeway, to connect city centers with suburbs. Of course, the 1950s are the start of a period of the suburbs, and you spoke somewhere about chocolate cities and vanilla suburbs. Can you explain that metaphor, and can you explain what actually happened during that time?
Yeah. I think it's important also to remember that, you know, highway construction was one component in a broader system of the spatial reorganization of American society in the second half of the 20th century. So in addition to highway construction, slum clearance, urban renewal, suburban development, all of these processes which were legislated from the top down, from the federal government, each of them were central to the spatial reorganization of American society. And that meant fueling suburban development, creating housing opportunities, housing programs on the suburban periphery of American cities. Part of the concerns were, I think, related to the Cold War, moving out of the city. I think people felt that cities would become targets in the prospect of a nuclear attack. But also people were looking to relocate to the suburbs, to move out of the old urban quarters where many immigrants had settled in the late 19th and early 20th century. The next generation, or the generation after that, was that generation of suburban development, or the suburban boom. Now, suburban development in the United States, going back to the 1930s, was also tied to racial segregation. And suburban development in the 40s and the 50s took shape through both public policies, but also private practices that ensured that suburban development in the post-World War II period would be a racially exclusive affair, that it would not include African Americans or other racial minorities. Now, a lot of that had to do with redlining policies of the 1930s vis-a-vis the Homeowners Loan Corporation. And that work created a blueprint to ensure that suburban development was largely restricted to white Americans, or people who qualified themselves as white, working class, middle class, and elites. And the way that suburban development was organized, property values were tied to the racial composition of neighborhoods. So, neighborhoods that had African-American families or other communities of color were not considered neighborhoods that were worthy of investment. And by tying property values to racial identity, that ensured that suburban development would exclude African Americans as a matter of economic investment, keeping people of color out of suburban neighborhoods in order to ensure long-term growth in the economic value of suburban neighborhoods.
Right. So you made a comparison between this new ideal of suburban life, also indicated with the term the white flight, and the dream world created by Walt Disney. That's intriguing. And can you expand a little bit on that parallel?
So, yeah, I mean, one of the points that I wanted to bring up in my book was that, at the outset of the post-World War II period, before Americans had an opportunity to really understand what total dependence upon the automobile would look like, how it would impact our cities, before smog, before traffic congestion, there was a lot of optimism and idealism about the prospect of a suburban urban network tied by freeways. Freeways were important symbols of modernity at the outset of the post-World War II period. And Walt Disney certainly was a part of that. Disneyland, in its opening in 1955, included a miniature freeway system called the Utopia ride. And even the name of that ride kind of implied the utopian prospects of the automobile freeway world. And there were other artists, other cultural producers of the time who asserted that kind of utopian idealization of freeways and the freeway metropolis. In art, in photography, Julius Schulman did some photographs of freeways that were part of his kind of mid-century portrait of Los Angeles as the modernist city.
But you happen to have some beautiful images. Maybe this is a good moment to share your screen. And
sure.
Yeah.
So here's one example of a photograph by Julius Schulman, the image on the right. He used that kind of, I think it's a prolonged shutter exposure or prolonged exposure to accentuate the lights of automobiles on the freeway. And that kind of reflects how Schulman played with the image to capture this kind of sense of modernity, of the rush of modernity. And when you juxtapose it with an image such as that on the left, you can kind of see how freeways fit into Julius Schulman's idea of cutting edge modernity in Los Angeles. And thanks in large part to the work of Schulman, Los Angeles during the 1950s and 60s kind of symbolized that modernist utopia of glass and steel and concrete. The interesting thing about Julius Schulman is that he grew up in the neighborhood of Boyle Heights, which is this area here. You can see its proximity to downtown Los Angeles. And Schulman's home was actually, his childhood home was destroyed by highway construction. And that is what prompted Schulman to move west. Ultimately, he settled in Laurel Canyon. And it was there that he set up his studio and developed these utopian portraits of the freeways and the modernist good life in Southern California. So
It's
Schulman—
hard to call it utopian when you look at these images nowadays. But that's a different perspective, of course.
Yeah, well, yes. You know, after the 1960s, there was a profound revision in understandings of freeways. And a lot of that revision was issued by communities of color, communities that were impacted negatively by highway construction, and communities that did not have the wherewithal or the access to relocate to Laurel Canyon or the West Side or the San Fernando Valley. The people who were kind of stuck in the shadows of freeways, if you will.
Right. Yeah, you described in both your books how freeways cut through existing neighborhoods and also triggered a lot of community resistance. But you also described that, generally speaking, the resistance from predominantly white and rich neighborhoods was much more successful than the resistance in where people of color lived and
Yeah.
poorer neighborhoods. How did that work?
Well, so there were protests all over Los Angeles in the 50s and 60s against highway construction. The earliest expressions of protest came from Boyle Heights in the early 1950s, 1952, 1953, where a multiracial, multilingual, multi-religious group of residents in Boyle Heights organized to protest and attempt to block the construction of all these freeways that converged upon Boyle Heights during the 50s and 60s. And you know, they utilized very traditional forms of protest, you know, petitions, demonstrations, packing the meetings of highway planners and the city council, but all to no avail. Despite their protests, 5 freeways encroached upon Boyle Heights, and you can kind of see how the freeways literally kind of strangled that community or quarantined that community, blocked it off from the rest of the city. On the other hand, Beverly Hills, in the early 1960s, the citizens there organized to block the construction of one freeway. And of course, they were very successful in their bid to block the proposal to turn Santa Monica Boulevard into the 2 freeway running from La Cañada Flint Ridge all the way to Santa Monica. So there are clear discrepancies along the lines of race and class in terms of who was able to block highway construction and who was not. And what happened in Los Angeles was a national pattern that happened in cities throughout the country.
Yeah, in what sense would you say was Los Angeles unique, or was it just one example among many with this along the same lines of development?
Well, Los Angeles was unique in the sense that it had a lot of space, undeveloped land on its suburban periphery. And LA kind of emerged as a suburban metropolis during the 1950s and 1960s, thanks in no small part to highway construction. That happened in other cities as well. But Los Angeles's identity at this time was closely tied to new suburban development, to highway construction, and to the automobile in a way that wasn't the case in other cities.
Right, okay, yeah. So you mentioned that in predominantly minority neighborhoods, resistance against freeway construction was less successful, but on the other hand, you also give multiple examples of cultural expressions that actually revigorated certain neighborhoods. And maybe we can have a look at some of your PowerPoint images, artwork in response to freeway construction. And please tell us something about those artistic responses.
Sure, I'd be happy to. So in the course of my research, especially here in Los Angeles and in other cities, I realized that there was a lot of cultural work around the image, the placement, of freeways in urban minority communities. So, going back to the example of Boyle Heights, even though Boyle Heights had been a multiracial, multi-ethnic, heterogeneous working class community in the early 20th century, by the 1960s and 1970s, Boyle Heights had transitioned into a more or less ethnically homogenous or monolithic concentration of Mexican American or Mexican immigrant working class poverty. And a lot of that had to do with the disruption of highway construction, which pushed many groups out of Boyle Heights to relocate elsewhere. And that created a space for Mexican Americans to come into the neighborhood. So by the 1970s, Boyle Heights was a predominantly Mexican American working class neighborhood. And in that decade, Boyle Heights became kind of an epicenter of Mexican American or Chicano activism in the 70s. And part of that activism, a large part of it included cultural production, cultural work. For many minority communities, especially racially minority communities. Cultural production is the most available means of expressing political and social dissent or protest. Because, quite simply, the lack of representation in government, urban minority groups had a lot of difficulties having their voice heard in government. So culture was a resort to alternative forms of activism. And according to the Chicano movement and the artists who were part of the Chicano movement, part of their agenda was to depict their community, to depict the world in which they lived. And so in doing the course of research for my book, I came to notice a lot of freeways in the art of Chicano activists in the 1970s and 1980s. And I started to wonder, why are there so many freeways in this work, in this cultural work? And I began to realize that each of these artists who lived in Boyle Heights during the 50s, during the 60s, and into the 70s, in terms of their appreciation for their neighborhood and trying to paint the image of their neighborhood, they noticed the freeway. They couldn't help but notice the freeway. The presence of the freeway is so ubiquitous in Boyle Heights that it figured prominently in this art. What's interesting is that if you look closely at a lot of these images, you can kind of get a sense of what freeways did to Boyle Heights. Freeways created a barrier between the barrio, or the Mexican-American neighborhood, and the rest of the city. Freeways divided the city from the Mexican-American community. Freeways were unsightly. Freeways were not something that you wanted to look at, especially in the bucolic landscape of a neighborhood park. Freeways were built in this park in Boyle Heights because it was cost effective. The government already owned this land, so why not run a freeway through it to save money? Well, that's great for the coffers of state and local government. It's not great for the people who live in the neighborhood. And there were also subversive portraits of freeways taken. One artist here lived adjacent to a highway that was built in Boyle Heights, and he remembered the sounds of car crashes on freeways, and that was a regular occurrence for him. And that translated into these kind of more subversive images as freeways as a lethal or a violent space. And then you have other examples of communities trying to transform the meaning of the freeway by making it relevant to the people who live in the immediate vicinity of freeways. So this is an example from San Diego, Chicano Park, where even though the community lost its effort to block the construction of a highway interchange in a Mexican-American neighborhood, they nonetheless demanded the right to paint murals on the concrete pylons that support that interchange. And today, Chicano Park is recognized as a national landmark for its depictions of Mexican-American history, identity, and culture.
Yeah, that's fascinating. The freeway becoming a canvas itself. Yeah. So, Eric, what would you say? You described the utopian context of freeway construction in the 1950s with its modernist aspirations. When and why did that narrative turn into a more dystopian perspective at some point?
Well, there were a variety of factors, but largely by the mid-1960s, there were protests all over the nation in cities throughout the country against highway construction. And the 1950s generation of highway builders had absolutely no regard for community impact or community input. And especially when white middle class or white upper class neighborhoods began to organize in opposition to highway construction, that's what kind of curtailed the power of highway builders by the late 1960s and early 70s. And so at that point, the federal government revised its highway building policies to mandate community input into the process of locating and building highways. Now, again, minority voices were absent from this conversation. But nonetheless, urban minority communities continue to express opposition through these cultural forms. The problem is that nobody really ever bothered to consider this as a form of protest.
Right.
But since these communities were not able to block the freeway in the way that Beverly Hills and other wealthy white neighborhoods were, this was the next available form of protest to that project.
Right, right. Thank you. So I would like to ask you one last question before we go to the Q&A, and that is in the conclusion of your book, The Folklore of the Freeway, you address the enduring struggles for spatial justice in urban life. And what do you see as the most pressing forms of spatial injustice nowadays? And what should be done to challenge or confront those issues?
That's a really good question. The fight against freeways in Boyle Heights inspired subsequent forms of activism in that neighborhood against the placement of, for example, a battery recycling plant that was planned to be built in Boyle Heights in the 1980s. In toxic waste dumps, prisons. These are all mobilizing urban communities of color in the name of spatial justice, in the name of environmental justice. But these concepts were not in the vocabulary of urban communities in the 1950s and 60s. But people learned lessons from highway construction. And from that, they learned how to organize or mobilize against subsequent forms of what we call spatial injustice. But again, that vocabulary didn't exist earlier. But now there are other struggles against other forms of what people perceive as environmental destruction or spatial injustice, such as the examples that I mentioned.
Right. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. We already have several questions in the Q&A, so let's move there. Please type your questions there and try to be concise. Let me start with an anonymous attendee who asks email question submission. Oh, sorry, it says email question submission from Moises Ponce Cepeda, history grad student at Cal State University, LA. Does the construction of freeways follow patterns of settler colonialism? Is this process distinct? And does a radical shift in the American workplace like COVID-19 accelerate urbanization processes? Actually, two questions, but yeah.
Yeah, that's a big, those are two big questions.
Right, right.
In terms of settler colonialism, I think, yes, you can certainly see the extension of highway construction as a form of settler colonialism, or the extension of settler colonialism, particularly in the context of suburban development or racially exclusive suburban development. You know, I do see that as an extension of LA's longer history of settler colonialism. But again, I would say that, you know, we didn't have the vocabulary of settler colonialism, you know, more than 10 years ago. So this is a new concept, and, you know, yes, we can rework the history of highway construction to talk about it as a form of settler colonialism. And I think that concept expands our understanding of what freeways did to cities like Los Angeles. And again, particularly in the context of suburban development or racially segregated suburban development. The second part of the question, remind me, Use?
So it asks about the impact of COVID-19 on urbanization processes and if this could accelerate things in urban planning.
Yeah, you know, it could. I don't know. I think it remains to be seen. But I think, you know, right now people are feeling very pessimistic about traditional patterns of downtown urban life. And I think people are beginning to reappreciate the seclusion and the privacy of highways and automobiles and suburban neighborhoods that afford distance or safe distance from crowds and congestion. And that was one of the founding ideals of American suburbia going back to the late 19th century, particularly around issues of disease and contagion and hygiene. Early suburbs, the earliest iteration of suburbs in American history were closely tied to theories of disease and hygiene. And I think right now COVID is kind of bringing that discourse back to our understanding of suburbs and cities as well. That's a really important question.
Okay, thank you. Yeah. The next one is by Anne Bobrov Hayal. She writes, my daughter lives in LA and is looking for a new apartment. She sent a link to one in the Culver City area the other day, and my immediate response was, but it's boxed in by highways. She immediately wrote back, it's a desirable neighborhood. So has perception of highways changed?
Oh, well, yeah, I mean, I think, you know, now Los Angeles is so developed that, you know, there are areas of the city that are in close proximity to freeways and people don't seem to mind. I mean, I think Culver City is one example. Echo Park is another example. Even Boyle Heights, the neighborhood that I was talking about, is currently in the beginning stages of gentrification. And that's a signal that, you know, there are investment opportunities in neighborhoods that are riddled with freeways. And the gentrifying class doesn't seem to be bothered by this. So maybe it is the fact that people are becoming more tolerant of freeways. Nonetheless, you know, there's a lot of new research about the toxicity of freeways and how living near freeways poses certain health risks to largely minority communities that had no choice but to live in the close proximity of a freeway. So, you know, I think it cuts both ways.
Right, thank you. The next question is by Bruce Hollihan. Don't you feel that the modern social ideas of the city of the future, such as exemplified by Robert Moses and Le Corbusier, have been found to be deleterious to social development, especially with regard to low-income minorities in the city?
Yes, in general, I do. I think, you know, public housing is a good example of those negative effects upon minority communities in particular. I think that's an area that has received a lot of attention from historians and urban scholars. And, you know, like highway construction, public housing has become a symbol of the dark side of the Moses Le Corbusier vision of cities. But, you know, at the same time, I don't think that Le Corbusier or Robert Moses necessarily had it wrong. I do think that they had ideas and plans that could have been good for people. You know, modernism and the modernist ideal of the city, you know, if you think about it in its most idealistic, earliest stages, you know, conceived of a more equitable and a more just city, a city that eradicated class distinctions, a city that eradicated rich neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods by providing access to air and light and mobility and speed to everyone, to the masses. The problem is that, you know, as Le Corbusier or Moses became more prominent or more powerful, they lost touch with those ideals. And as city governments and state governments and federal governments became more cash-starved in the course of the 20th century, they realized that concrete, steel, and glass could be an expedient and efficient form of constructing housing for poor people without much concern about the well-being of those poor people themselves. But those were mistakes that I don't think were built into the modernist blueprint for the transformation of the American city. There's a book somewhere out there by Nathan Glazer called Modernism from a Cause to a Style. And the thesis of that book is that, you know, modernism began in the early 20th century with a lot of idealism. Idealism about eradicating distinctions and class inequalities. But those ideas went out the door, and modernism eventually became a style. You know, the photographs of Julia Schulman are the best example of the kind of stylistic attributes of modernism, but without that idealistic component, without that social cause of creating a more just city. So that's a huge question. It's a complicated question, but those are my own kind of personal thoughts on the matter.
Great, thank you. By the way, we have a few more questions. Maybe we can go back to speaker's view.
Sure.
Okay, thank you, yeah. In the meantime, let me read Paul Lerner's question. Thanks for the fascinating discussion. Were there urban revitalization programs in LA in the 60s and 70s, as in Fresno and other US cities? It has attempts to create pedestrian zones downtown to combat sprawl, traffic segregation, etc.
In Los Angeles, not yet. I don't think that would come until like the 1980s or 90s, because, you know, in the 60s, you know, the outdoor suburban shopping mall was still kind of the paradigm of pedestrian life, where you drive your car from your suburban home to the shopping mall, park your car, and then, you know, the pedestrian experience is confined to this contained, controlled space. Theme parks worked in the same way, you know, Disneyland. Even, you know, so-called urban institutions like Dodger Stadium, which was built in the late 1950s, was built on a kind of suburban model of urban space, a self-contained master plan environment that's wholly surrounded by a vast parking lot and totally divorced from the pedestrian life and urban fabric of the city. So well into the 1960s, LA was still building according to those kind of suburban models of contained, controlled, enclosed, master planned space. In the 70s, with a resurgence of immigration, especially from Mexico and Central America and Asia, people from these parts of the world brought their own kind of pedestrian traditions with them, and were able to kind of create new downtown pedestrian environments, but from the bottom up. instead of the top down.
Right. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. The next question is from Elizabeth Drummond. I'm curious about the ways in which freeways are politicized today as part of the Black Lives Matter and other protests, both as a site of protest, but also as a site of protest because of the ways that highways have bifurcated communities.
Yes. No, that's a great question. You know, if you've noticed, you know, in the recent spate of urban protests across the country, it has been a tactic or a strategy of protesters to take over the space of the freeway. And I think it's a very deliberate, I also think it's a very shrewd strategy to shut down some of the vital organs of the city to draw attention to a particular cause. I think it's rich with symbolic resonance to see a multiracial crowd of urban protesters taking over a freeway in the same way that freeways took over urban minority neighborhoods in the 1950s and 60s. There's kind of like an inverse of tactics and strategy there. As to whether or not, you know, the current generation of protesters are cognizant of that history of how highways decimated urban minority communities, their tactic of taking over freeways nonetheless, I think, serves their intentions to draw attention and to shut down parts of the city in their demands for social justice and racial equity.
Right. Thank you. We have time for one last question, which I take from the chat box, Malika Yurkasimova. She writes, there are plans to remove cars from Manhattan and San Francisco. Do you see something like this taking place in parts of the urban core of Los Angeles, or is LA's car culture precluding any of such ideas?
No, I think currently there are proposals in the making about implementing a similar kind of congestion pricing system that exists in many cities around the world. New York is just beginning congestion pricing. Singapore and London, I think, were two of the first major cities to implement congestion pricing. I think San Francisco is also beginning its own congestion pricing program. That's where you have to pay a toll to drive on congested streets, particularly during rush hour or impacted times of the day. I think LA is going to consider congestion pricing. It's already started something similar with the tolls on freeways and reserving certain lanes for high occupancy vehicles. But the actual streets of the city, I think, are under review for a congestion pricing system. My concern is, you know, how is that going to impact working class and poor commuters in the city? You know, LA has become so expensive. Sorry about that. LA has become so expensive that people are moving farther and farther out, away from centers of employment in Los Angeles, and undertaking these ridiculous commutes that are, you know, 2 hours or longer. I'm worried that congestion pricing is going to make it even more difficult for working class communities to access the roads and to get to work on time. So, you know, that's something that I think really has to factor into the assessment of whether or not congestion pricing can work in Los Angeles. Really, really important question.
Thank you. And Eric, thank you very much for this wonderful interview. It was really enlightening and I enjoyed it very much.
Likewise.
Okay. So next week, my guest is Aniko Imre, Professor of Cinematic Studies at USC. And we will speak about spaces of television between propaganda and consumerism and discuss differences and also surprising similarities between capitalist and communist television, as well as the post-communist afterlife of television culture. So I hope to see you then. Have a good week.